Hi, I'm John Nash, and welcome to Café UCEA. What are the evolving roles for the federal and state government in the aftermath of the latest revision of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now branded as the Every Student Succeeds Act? In this episode of Café UCEA, we will discuss the devolution of power to the states and the appropriate federal and state roles for incentivizing equity and building capacity. We're going to spend the next 20 to 30 minutes trying to unpack some of this, and you can participate by watching this via Google+. At the bottom right of the video window, click Ask a New Question, then type your question and click Submit. We'll do the best to answer it during the show. My guest today is Dr. Ann Blankenship of the University of Southern Mississippi and co-editor of a special issue of the Education Policy and Law Review, which focused on ESSA. Ann, welcome to Café UCEA.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
You're very welcome. It's great to have you. So talk to us a little bit about the timeline we've been under on getting to this new version known as ESSA, and a little bit about the highlights there.
Of course. So as we know, ESSA is a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, enacted as part of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. It was originally designed to provide supplemental educational services for primarily students from poverty, but also it targeted other groups of vulnerable students, particularly English language learners, Native Americans. So shift forward several decades, and the bill has been continually reauthorized, and each time it's taken a little bit of a different shape. So beginning in the early 80s with the Reagan administration, we really saw the first big shift into a bigger focus on standards and accountability. It wasn't until the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, with the enactment of No Child Left Behind, that that really got taken to the next level, when the main focus of federal education policy was accountability. And it changed the relationship between the states and the federal government. Instead of two groups working cooperatively to support these particular groups of students that were perhaps at particular risk of failure, instead it was more like the federal government was kind of like an angry supervisor, looking to see when the states were going to fail and what the punishment was going to be for failure. And ultimately, it wasn't the state that paid the price, it was the student. So with the Obama administration, we really saw a double down on that accountability focus, with the Race to the Top incentive program and with the NCLB waivers. You know, the waivers were a release from some of the requirements of NCLB, but they came with a price. They were conditioned on states enacting legislation that the White House and specifically the Secretary of Education saw as necessary school reforms, and a lot of those were focused on increasing accountability, using standardized test scores to make employment decisions, like teacher evaluations and tenure decisions, and it really it pushed it into federal encroachment, and it really pushed states and teachers to the breaking point. And I think that we can see ESSA as a direct response to that change in relationship, where, you know, we had the pendulum swing so far one way in terms of federal intervention and oversight, and ESSA's response is really a very limited federal role, particularly for the role of the Secretary of Education.
So the pendulum really has swung back?
Yeah, almost. I mean, some would argue to the Reagan administration, some would argue perhaps even further, that the federal government really gives some general guidelines and provides money, but the funding mechanism is more Reagan-esque, and the oversight is much more limited than we've seen in the last few decades.
Wow. So take us through some of these highlights that really represent this swinging of the pendulum back to the other direction. What are the stark differences, and what should we be thinking about now?
Okay, well, starting with funding, the funding mechanism is a little bit different. Instead of a lot of categorical funding, we're seeing more block funding. So I think they eliminated about 250 special programs and put it all into one big bucket of money that will be sent to states. And the interesting thing is there's general suggestion on how to use it, but the states are given a lot of flexibility. In terms of Title I funding, the formula remains the same, and the money is going to remain with the assigned school. The money is not going to follow the child yet. But there are a couple of proposed pilot programs in the bill that allow a select number of states to play around with some different models of having all the money go into one pot and have more flexibility in terms of funding transfers and programs that allow a little bit of experimentation with having those Title I funds actually follow the student if they decide to move from one school to another or even from one district to another. Also, we see a lot more funding for early childhood education with the Preschool Development Grants Program, which is kind of co-supervised by the Department of Education and Health and Human Services. So those are really the big funding takeaways. In terms of performance indicators, I think this is where we see the most dramatic changes. It retains the accountability framework of NCLB, but the federal government plays a smaller role in the actual decision-making process. Jack Jennings actually referred to ESSA as NCLB light. So states are responsible for setting their own long and short-term goals. They create this plan for what their goals are going to be, what the performance indicators are going to be, and what their interventions are going to be. And they, yeah.
If I can ask, those changes that are now in the hands of the states, are those to happen at the State House, or are they happening inside the Departments of Education in the respective states?
It's going to have to be a negotiation between the two. I mean, ultimately, it's going to be up to the legislature to figure out how the funding is allocated. And in different states, you have a different power dynamic between the legislature and the Department of Education. So some legislatures have more control over the Department of Education. It depends a little bit on whether the Department of Education at the state level is written into the Constitution or whether they get their power from state legislation.
I see.
So the states are going to come up with these plans that they're required to submit to the federal government. And here's where it gets a little bit interesting, because they submit the plan and there is a board that reviews the plan and either approves it or denies it. There's a system for appealing a disapproval. The Secretary of Education plays a very, very limited role. And the way it's written is that most states are going to get what they want in this situation. And there's not a lot of enforcement written in to ESSA. So the states come up with these plans, and there's some, there are other mandates in ESSA, but the way that the Secretary of Education's control has been limited, it's hard to see who's going to be responsible for enforcing not just the federal mandates, but the state's own plans. So that should be interesting to watch. Let's see. States are still required to do testing, grades 3 through 8, and once in high school for math and reading, and they're still required to look at the data based on subgroups. There was a trend under NCLB to use what were called super subgroups, where states would put several subgroups together to kind of ease some low test score data in one subgroup with higher test scores in another. That's prohibited under the new legislation.
May I ask, while I have you on the topic of data, because
yeah, absolutely.
Joe has submitted a question about how the winds are blowing around what ESSA might mean for data use in schools. Is there anything else besides just the testing mandate that might pertain to the way the Act is articulated?
I think we're going to see more of the same in terms of data reliance, because it's a compliance-driven legislative measure. You know, I still think that that test data is going to be the holy grail. Now, they have worked in some flexibility for other performance indicators. Students will no longer solely be judged based on this one test. States are required to include additional performance indicators, and they have some flexibility on what those are going to be, and those are different based on the level of school. There are different performance indicators for elementary and middle school, and then for high school, graduation rate is one of those that they're required to look at, actually. So there's a lot more flexibility built in for the states, but there's very little guidance given on how states might go about approaching this, or how they might tackle reducing the achievement gaps with their subgroups. I mean, they're still required to track them, but there's really no guidance as to what they do with that information.
I get the sense from your commentary on this that, and we talked about it in the intro, sort of a devolution of the power to the states, but then this sort of thread of, well, there's very little guidance on how they're going to do this. Are you expecting 50 diverse plans? Are the legislators and the departments of ed prepared to articulate all this in a robust way? Are they going to just fly in the wind on this? What's your sense on that?
I think that's a really interesting question. So one thing that is required under the ESSA is that interventions have to be based on sound research-based evidence. So there is that requirement, but there's so much research-based evidence out there, right? And as scholars, we know that you can find research that says just about anything is the right way to do it. So I do think that we're going to see a lot more variety in how states react to this. But I will say that one of my concerns is that for a lot of states, they don't necessarily have the capacity to tackle this problem, because, you know, they have been kind of inundated with this test-based accountability mindset, and without additional training or information or support, you know, I fear that we're going to see a lot of what we've seen in the past just at the state level instead of the federal level. I think we'll see a lot of states trying to figure out, like, how do we make this NCLB thing work at the state level and seem a little bit more palatable?
Right, right. Well, and Ed Fuller's posing a question here that, ESSA pushes states into some policy that may not be research driven, such as teacher and principal academies. Is that something on your radar?
Yeah, so there are some interesting provisions in Title II that really strengthen alternative route teacher and leader certification programs. I know that there's certainly been some scholars speaking out with real concern about whether that it's going too far in terms of the federal government trying to tell states who they have to identify as a quality teacher in their state, which is really interesting because so much of ESSA is pulling back, and then there's this one little section that says, okay, you have flexibility in all these ways, but in this particular area, you are going to consider these certain teachers legitimate under your state law. And I suspect that there will be some litigation on that, probably in the next couple of years, challenging whether or not that is an overreach on the federal government's part. But he is absolutely right that there are some interesting overreaching provisions in Title II that I am not sure how they really snuck in there, because they're a little bit unlike the rest of the spirit. But certainly I think that there is some concern about whether they are tied to what we generally consider research-based solutions.
So what other big changes do you see for states with this pendulum swing?
So in terms of curriculum, they have full choice in what they select. Common Core is still an option, but the Secretary of Education is specifically prohibited from making any sort of suggestions, which I thought was particularly funny. I mean, that was a real dig, I think specifically at Arne Duncan. Teacher evaluation, I think, is another Title II area that, in my opinion, I think they really got right.
How so?
So I think what we saw with Race to the Top and the waivers was a real push for states to incorporate standardized test scores as a significant part of teacher evaluations. And, there's been a lot of concern that, student achievement tests aren't designed for that and don't necessarily reflect teacher quality. They're not even designed to test teacher quality. So Title II provides funding for states to improve their teacher evaluation tools, which has to be so frustrating for states, because it, in the last 15 years we've had reform after reform after reform on this specific topic, but it is looking to decrease the reliance on student achievement data and look at multiple measures of performance, and requires that teachers be given clear, timely, and useful feedback as part of their evaluation, which I think was really missing under the Race to the Top and NCLB waiver evaluation tools.
Mm-hmm. Back on the matter of data, we have another question from a viewer, and it's Ed Fuller, talking about data use again. There's much abuse and misuse of data. You were mentioning a little bit about the use of data, I think, with regard to the teacher part. Is there anything in ESSA that promotes good use of data, as the work, like the work that's been done by Vincent Cho and others?
Certainly, I think the focus on subgroups is still positive, and I think the prohibition from using the super subgroups, I think, will lead to more meaningful subgroup data. So at least states will have an opportunity to identify areas of weakness with certain subgroups and design interventions for them, instead of getting this data on, you know, all subgroups together, and having that not really be a meaningful opportunity for targeted interventions.
So do you have any overall concerns that you want to share as you've thought through this?
Absolutely. Certainly, I've pointed out that there are some benefits to this change. I know that a lot of people are saying that anything is better than what we had, but I'm concerned that while it's better, it may not be ultimately the fix that we need at this point.
How so?
Well, it's still compliance driven and focused on failure. You know, states are still required to identify those failing schools instead of SIGs. Now you have turnaround schools, where, you know, they're looking at the bottom 5% and schools with low graduation rates, and the focus is still really on, like, how do we deal with these failing schools, instead of, like, what are actual innovative solutions to fix these problems. So I think Jennings was right in, you know, comparing NCLB and ESSA. I mean, it's more flexibility, but the focus is still really on failure. I think capacity is going to be a huge issue for states. I mean, in Washington, D.C., you have such an amazing number of resources in terms of educational research. You have so many think tanks and, I mean, lobbyists that actually provide a wealth of information, and it's really a confluence of research. And when you spread that out into the 50 states, you know, state legislators don't have the same access to quality research that federal lawmakers will have. So that's going to be a real challenge on how to educate lawmakers at the state level.
Do you think that's an opening for relationships between research universities and other, well, even teaching institutions, any of those, any higher ed institution and the State House?
Absolutely. I think it really raises the responsibility of research-based universities to focus more on what education policy looks like in their state and state-specific reform efforts, because certainly that's where, you know, the onus, the responsibility is now on those state legislators, and, you know, they're not necessarily going to get it anywhere else if scholars in that state don't step up to help. I do think that students in some states are going to fare better than others. I think that educational opportunity is going to be more closely tied to geography.
As a result of resources that those states have, and what kind of students are going to do better than others in your estimation?
I think resources are going to play a big part, and I think that theory, like the actual mindset of state legislators, is going to be a big motivating factor in, you know, how states progress. I live in Mississippi, and like the kind of overall mindset is coming from a little bit of a deficit model of thinking. Like, you know, how do we get out of 50? Whereas you have states like Massachusetts that are continuously on the cutting edge of education quality, and they're going to be making different decisions because they've already been going past the minimum required by the federal government. So, I think that you already have a vast difference in capacities in terms of education policy, and I think that those differences in capacities are really going to play out in the classroom in terms of what students are ultimately provided with. And as I mentioned before, the enforcement mechanisms seem really weak, so I don't know ultimately who's going to hold the state responsible for even sticking to their own plans.
So you've just edited a special issue on this. Tell us a little bit about what's in this and why we ought to be diving into it.
I am so excited about this special issue. It was originally designed to provide proposals for the reauthorization, and has kind of turned into something else. And I think it is perfectly timed with the White House's announcement of the Stronger Together grant program. A lot of the deficits that we see in ESSA in terms of focus on equality of educational opportunity and maybe some civil rights issues, I think that both the states and the federal government will have an opportunity to focus on those and strengthen those in other ways. So we have several pieces in the special issue that look at how states and districts can improve diversity in intra-district and inter-district. For example, Chris Suarez looks at the New York State model and how they used SIG funding to create socioeconomic diversity within district and between districts. We have Emily Hodge, Kendra Taylor, and Erica Frankenberg did an amazing piece on how we're really seeing an increase in dual segregation with race and socioeconomic isolation, and they give some really concrete proposed solutions about inter and intra-district transfers, incentives for suburban districts, particularly in terms of safe haven provisions for accountability measures. My favorite of their recommendations is state support for new school construction. It seems like such a simple solution to have those new schools constructed, built in locations where integration would be a natural byproduct. To be more thoughtful about where we're putting our new resources. I mean, that's just a few of the many really concrete recommendations they give. Kara Finnegan and Jennifer Jellison Holmes did a case study in Milwaukee and really looked at some successes and failures in their suburban city transfer program and made some suggestions about how there really has to be political buy-in, and that interventions really need to be targeted, place-based, but also regional. That there have to be both efforts there, or ultimately the benefits are going to fade. So those are just some of the pieces that I'm excited about. It's a special issue, so it's 10 amazing articles. We have really epic pieces from Gary Orfield and Jack Jennings that are kind of all-encompassing looks at where we've come from and where we're going. So I think it's going to be a really exciting read.
That's great. I think it's probably an important read for not only us, but get it to our friends in the state houses and in the departments of ed, too.
Absolutely.
So we like to point our show, if we can, towards not only our peer scholars, but practitioners as well. In the remaining couple of minutes we have, do you have any takeaways that you want to have us keep in mind?
Absolutely. For administrators, I think it's going to be really important that if they don't already have a good working relationship with their state legislators, that now is the time. because the responsibility is not just on them, the legislators, it's on our school leaders to really identify areas of need and to seek out research-based solutions. It's no longer the federal government's responsibility. This is now the state's responsibility, and the district and school leaders have to be part of that solution. So I know that they are not often included as much as they should be in the solutions conversation, but that's going to have to change. I think for scholars, we are going to have to find better ways to disseminate research to states, to districts, to school leaders, to legislators, in a way that they can consume it, not in these massive scholarly products that are impossible to read, but in really practice-friendly formats. And I think we're going to have to study these changes systematically. Gary Orfield concludes his piece with a call to really look at how this plays out, so we can know in 4 years, when it's up for reauthorization, areas where we can correct and maybe get a little bit back to the middle of the pendulum.
Really good, really good. Well, that's the time we have for today. So, Anne, I want to say thank you very much for joining us and giving this overview of what we have coming up with ESSA.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's our show for today. Café UCEA is produced by the University Council for Educational Administration. Marcy Reedy at the University of Virginia co-produced the show. An archive of this program and the show notes can be found on the UCEA Google Plus page. I'm John Nash at the University of Kentucky. Thanks, and see you next time.